welcome to Music Stuff with Spock. There seems to be a resurgence of interest in graphic notation these days, and this happens in cycles every few decades. Graphic notation began in the 1950s as a reaction to the avant-garde, which increasingly tries to notate and control every aspect of a piece of music. The experimental composers wanted to leave more room for interpretation by the performer to the point of improvisation. The scores of the avant-garde became increasingly more complex and therefore difficult to perform. The experimental composers were looking for ways to notate similar sounds that were easier to write and read. So today, we're going to look at some of the aspects and styles of graphic notation. I'll show and explain a few things, and then I'll write a brief passage using that notation and perform it, and then you can see the correlation between the graphics and the sounds, and use these ideas for your own pieces, or at the very least, have a better understanding of what's happening when you look at a graphic score. Not all pieces that use graphic symbols are what we would consider a graphic score. Little by little, certain symbols and elements of graphic notation have been adopted into standard notation, like microtonal accidentals for pitch, X's and squares for notes and clusters and chords, lines and shapes for glissandi and timbral effects, and pictures to represent instruments, the placement of a player's hands, or where to play on their instrument. So here are some of the more commonly used graphic symbols. Notes. Individual notes are represented by a variety of symbols and shapes, and as long as you have a detailed legend explaining the symbols you are using, you can use anything you want. However, notes are frequently represented by simple shapes like dots and circles, squares and rectangles, and X's. In standard notation, individual notes can be written with an X for a note head if the sound is not a tone, but a noise sound, like tapping on the body of a violin. Or if it is a note of indeterminate pitch, where the pitch of the note is left up to the performer. This can also be done by using notes with no heads. The top of the stem gives you a general idea of the pitch of the note, but you have leeway up or down a tone or so. In a graphic score, unless there is a staff or some other kind of frequency orientation, the pitches of the notes are frequently indeterminate and left up to the performer. Individual notes can be represented by dots, X's, and small circles and squares, but sometimes they are represented by just a line. The length of the line tells you the duration. The height of the line governs the approximate pitch of the note. And changes in the line can represent changes in the pitch of the note. Sometimes notes are represented by one symbol, and a line is used to show the duration or variations in pitch of the note. A change in the thickness of a line or shape can represent a change in dynamics. Chords and clusters of notes can be represented with various configurations of dots or lines, where the vertical spacing relates to the relative pitch of the notes in the chord. But are frequently drawn as squares or rectangles. The wider the shape, the larger the chord. Rectangles are well suited to scores and most chordal instruments, but are particularly effective for the piano, organ, and other keyboard instruments. The size of various rectangles can conform to clusters played with the fingers, the palm, the whole hand, and the forearm. If we are not going to use standard notation, then all these various symbols and shapes must somehow be presented in an easily understood format, and composers have tried many ways in which to do that. I think two of the most widely used and comprehensible are called cell notation and frame notation. Cell notation breaks a composition down into little bits, usually single phrases or motifs, now called gestures, but sometimes for longer sections. And these motifs and sections are written in a box or some other similar confining shape. A cell can contain notes in standard notation, graphic symbols, or a combination of the two. Sometimes the duration of the cell is notated in one of the corners, and a cell can contain smaller cells within the larger one. Frame notation, or field notation, takes the sonic spectrum and represents it as an open rectangle, sort of like looking at a field from above or at an empty picture frame. In the field are symbols and shapes that represent the sounds to be interpreted. Sometimes the duration of the frame is notated, and sometimes it is left up to the performer. A field is usually read, as usual, from left to right, with up representing higher notes and down representing lower notes. However, it depends on the piece and how it is drawn. Some scores use a spiral that is read from the middle outwards, or some other complicated shape. Sometimes the field can contain cells, which would be played in some particular order. All the directions on how to interpret the shapes and in what order to play things would be outlined in the legend. So there's an introduction to some of the symbols and concepts involved when using graphic notation. Join me in part 2, where we will explore these concepts further.